Hi folks, so some of you may have already caught my little chat upstairs about inspecting what you expect when you test and monitor your APIs. So I promise I'm not going to do a full rehash, but I'm here representing IBM's API Connect, and I'm going to show you a little bit about both the core API Connect platform, a real quick portion of that, and then API Connect Test and Monitor, which is your alternative to our good friends who are just up here at Postman, and they've made some decisions and align really well at some things, and we've made decisions in a little bit of a different way and may align in other ways that could be useful to you also. So we're going to talk a little bit about it, and I'm going to show you some things, and I'm going to take on the challenge of live demos. So I welcome your patience with that. So I want to start by talking about why again, and I promise this isn't too deep of a recap for those of you that already saw, but I think it's important for anyone who might have missed it. At IBM, we're driven by a why, and the why behind the software that we create is to help our customers overcome a particularly challenging environment. They need to be both secure and open at the same time. They need to make APIs available to people programmatically at scale, but also to make sure that those APIs are protected properly and that only the people who should have them have access to them. And that's why we've also launched API Connect Test and Monitor, to allow our API provider customers to better understand their API consumers. So just a second ago, we were talking about service owners and service consumers, similar kind of concept, but we're going to put some delightful drawings on it that our designers have drawn. And there's a couple different personas that you could be as an API provider. You could be the API developer. You could be the API product manager that's making sure that these APIs are actually managed as products, like a lot of us believe it should be. You could be the operations person who is responsible for making sure that these APIs are continuously available. And each of these people could benefit from a deeper understanding of their API consumer, Andre, the application developer here. Because that's the purpose, right? That's why we're here. We're here to provide an API that is functional, that it is both secure and open and adds actual value to the consumers that are building on our APIs. And to recap, testing and monitoring, got to inspect what you expect. I'm not going to go deep into the history that I have and tie together again, but it's important to have a hello world check, an inspection and a validation, and then continuous monitoring. So you want to be looking to make sure that the API responds. You want to understand the response code, the latency, the payload. You want to inspect and validate and make sure that each piece of that API response is what you expected it to be if you are the consumer that you are pretending to be. If you're the consumer that has a plan that accesses a specific strict rate limit, you want to make sure that it fails after it exceeds that rate limit. If you're a consumer that's accessing it on the plan that lets you call it as much as you want, it should be successful. If you want an email to be an email, then you want to validate that that's correct also. And then you want to keep these monitors running continuously for an extended period of time. So I mentioned I'm not a developer. I'm a product manager, but sometimes I play a developer on stage, and hopefully I'm able to play that fairly effectively. So this is a simple guest book application that I colored by numbers to create. It just runs on some serverless and a database. And this is to show that it's live. I typed this in advance so I wouldn't waste too much time. It's basically working on APIs in the back end. Oh no. Let's do a new one. All right. Well, it may not be functioning well enough for the web UI right now, but it is calling and receiving from an API that's protected by an endpoint. And now, if I wanted to allow someone else to call this API instead of just calling it myself, I may not want to let them call that same API that's just unprotected, that has a full enablement for whatever kind of rate limit I want. So if I came into my API Connect dashboard and I wanted to be able to develop an API for that, I'd be able to define it if I wanted to from the beginning, or I could just import one that I already happen to have on hand, strategically placed with a search that's right here. And then we also have this concept of getting you going really quickly. If you check to, oh no. Okay, so here's the problem is I already tested this out and I didn't change the name. So the good news is we can go and look at that one that was already created. So this is the one that was already created, and I should have changed the name a little bit up from it. I've got this API that's already defined, and I can look at all the details that I want of it, or I can come over and I can manage it in a little bit more detail. So that's the secure and the manage portion. But then it's also important for us to be able to share it. And so this is our API portal where the API consumer, Andre in this case, is able to come, and now I've changed hats from whatever mashup of Siobhan or Steve I was before. And now I'm Andre, and I need to be able to subscribe to this API. So after I've signed up to subscribe to it, and I get my client ID, which I'll let you see for just a second, and take it away, I can choose to test and monitor that. And we have a couple of ways we can do that. One of the ways that we provide is this desktop client, which is similar to other tools you may have seen. And this is a pretty basic send and response that lets us do that basic functions check. Makes sure that it actually gets what we expect it to. It did. It gives me the status codes, the duration that it took. And this is nice, and I can save several of them. I can save some with no rate limit, or I can save them subscribed to different plans, and I can test these out by clicking on them time and again. But if I come in through the web interface, and this is open and free for anybody to check out, and I encourage you to if you'd like, we replicate it again in the web. And the reason that we do that is this is where the real power comes in. So if I've sent a call, which just happened just now, I can see in the same way that I can on the client on the web or on the laptop, I can see the same thing on the web. But what I can also do is I can generate a test automatically. And rather than having to, I do have to put it into a project. Rather than having to define everything that I expect out of this API, it's going to make a lot of guesses for me. So it's going to take a look at this and it's going to describe it in this graphical user interface if that's where I'm more comfortable, or I can switch over and look at it in code if I'm more comfortable with that. And it's going to describe, hey, by looking at this, I assume that you want to send a GET to the endpoint you did. I do. That you want to have this client ID, and I can make these variables and put them into my vault so that it can be shared across different groups and referenced. I assume you want a payload response. I assume you want to have a 200, that you want to have a JSON, that you want your payload to be in an arrays. And then this is where it starts to get more detailed, that you want your email to be an email, that your icon should be a URL instead of an image itself. And I can change any of these. I can go in and override it. I could assert instead of assert is, I can assert exists, and that'll fundamentally change what it's looking for. If I switch back over, well, in the past, I've got others that are switching back and forth simply between is and exists. Let's try that one more time. There we go. So now you might have caught that here in the GUI now, it no longer says email has to be email, it just has to exist. And that could be useful because I may not want whatever this particular array is to be strictly limited. I may want it to be a little bit more open. And here I've got an array of various tests. So here's where it can be helpful. After I've already auto-generated this and I've gone in and edited, you may want to have a strict test that wants the email to be an email and the URL to be a URL. You may also have a rate limit that you want to exceed and make sure that it fails, and it does. Or you may want to just run all of them and make sure that the ones that should be succeeding are succeeding, the ones that you expect to fail are failing, the ones that if you've strictly defined what it should be and you've fed it some data, like say some emails that are not emails, you want it to say that's not an email. And we get that ability to have it all in one place. You can keep these going. These tests don't have to be something that you click on. They can be monitored for you continuously. And I've got these with several different projects that I can dig down into. This is the guestbook one, the one that we've been playing with. And so you can see I've been running these for quite some time. And I can look at them in the logs. I can look at them in simplified metrics. And I can look at them in terms of their availability. Just did it work or did it not work? And I can dig down into each one of these. So if there's a failure and I want to know more about it, I can look a little bit closer. And this one, it's pretty simple, but we can see here that I meant to exceed this. I got a 429 that I wasn't authorized because I exceeded my rate limit. But if I wanted to dig into any more detail, I could do so. There's another interesting capability here, and that is by knitting this together, this one's not running on a live endpoint because the environment for this is something that we have to spin up on demand, and we've got it isolated for that reason. But it's interesting to look at because within this test, it's possible to mix more than just a simple get and a validation like what we've been looking at together. So this is actually the ability to, once you have an API Connect environment like we looked at the beginning that lets you secure, manage, and share your APIs, this will post to it, take the token, and then it'll get the right profiles. And then from that, it's actually going to go out and set up everything that's needed to create and publish an API and a product on my behalf. So if you put the time and the work into it, you can create entire user flows of what you would expect a user to actually do between gets and posts and updates. And then you can set these same ones if you have it running against an environment that's in production and you're not worried about getting completely beat up after you've shown it at a conference. You can continue to monitor your own environments as long as you want with whatever flows you want. So to switch back over to try and summarize a little bit, what I've tried to show you here is the tooling that we've made to help enable you as an API provider or as an API consumer to see the point of view in the world as your API consumer does, to be able to check just the basics. Does the call and response work? Is it functional? Does it carry a payload? Does the payload look like what I expect it to? To go deeper and inspect and validate beyond the codes that the contents of those are what you expect them to do, and potentially to work out of those multiple iterative actions, and then to continually monitor it, to keep running that continuously, to have dashboarding and alerting that lets you know if any of those fail, and let you test both the positive and the negative conditions, because there are times when you want successes and there are times when you want failures. The example of rate limiting, the example of not having a token, the example of sending a query and parameters that shouldn't be accepted. These are things you want to know are failing, like our friends at the security presentation were saying. So I'll join back up again for the questions in just a minute, but thank you very much. If you'd like to try your own demo, you're welcome to do so at that link. It's free, and we welcome anybody's feedback. Thank you.